And we are now recording. Is Carol back, I wonder?
Oh, yes.
You are? Okay, great. You know what? It's about 5:34, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ike Pulver. I'm the director of the Saratoga Springs Public Library, and it is a great pleasure to host this conversation this evening between Andre Perry and Amon Emeka as part of our Saratoga Reads community reading and discussion series in partnership with Skidmore College and the Saratoga Book Festival. Before I turn the event over to Ellen Beal, who is the president of the Book Festival, I would like to introduce our speakers for the night. I'd like to welcome a very special guest, Carol Daggs, who is the author of this year's Saratoga Reads selection, Saratoga Soul, Brantville Blues, which is about several generations of the Daggs family in the Brantville section of Saratoga, which is historically Black, historically rural, and now is smack dab in the middle of some very high-end gentrifying development, which kind of dovetails nicely with the themes of Dr. Perry's new book. We do know that some folks have had, because it is self-published, have had a little bit of trouble getting their hands on Carol's book, but I want to let you know that we do have about 50 copies in circulation at the library. There are several of them are available the last time I checked. The library is now open for browsing, for picking up holds without appointments on days when we don't get 2 inches of ice the night before. Carol, you can also purchase the book directly from Carol. And Carol, if you want to let people know how they might be able to do that, now is an opportunity.
Oh, thank you. I do have secure online options available via PayPal and Cash App. But for folks who may not use a computer, the option would be an old school order form. And I collect orders from my PO box, and I can generally turn them around the same day or by the next day.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that, and congratulations on being our book this year. I wanted to let people know that they can visit SaratogaREADS.org and SSPL.org for lots more information about all of the programs and events that are inspired by this selection, and the Junior Companion Wish Tree by Catherine Applegate. Carol, not to put you on the spot, but you shared with me some good news this afternoon. Would you like to share that here?
Oh, yes, thank you. Just so people can appreciate that a delay is not always a denial on your journey. Last year, I applied for some grants, and then when COVID kind of broke out, just everything kind of went on the wayside. So I learned earlier this month that I am the recipient of 2 grants. The first one is the New York Foundation for the Arts, Keep New York State Creating. And the second is the Time for Reckoning grant, which was given through the Center for Law and Justice in Albany.
Awesome, congratulations.
Help things with the book keep moving along.
Congratulations. That is great news. You know what? I guess without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Ellen Beal to introduce our guests for this evening, to say a few words about the Saratoga Book Festival. And Ellen, the floor is yours. If you're muted, feel free to unmute yourself and take it away.
Thank you, Ike, and welcome to all of you joining us, and welcome to our special guests. I have the pleasure of working with Ike and a number of other people in the community on Saratoga Book Festival. We've been hosting these monthly virtual programs leading up to what we hope to be our very first festival, October 15th through 17th, 2021. Certainly, like everyone, we have been doing a lot of reading during this incredibly strange and often challenging time that we're living through. And part of that has most definitely been to listen to the ongoing sort of reckoning that this country is having, a very long overdue series of questions and conversations. And our hope is very much to create a book festival that provides amplification for diverse voices and a forum to both pose very difficult questions and have probing conversations. So we're excited about tonight's program because we think this is a good start to what we hope to be an ongoing conversation. So put October 15th through 17th on your calendar, and we hope to see you then. Tonight, as we said, you're in for a real, I think, a really fascinating conversation. Let us welcome Dr. Andre M. Perry, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. He will be in conversation with Dr. Amon Emeka, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the First Year Experience at Skidmore College. Dr. Perry's research focuses on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. Since 2013, Perry's column on educational equity has appeared in the Hechinger Report, a nonprofit news organization focused on producing in-depth education journalism. Perry also contributes to theroot.com and the Washington Post. His views, opinions, and educational leadership have been featured on CNN, PBS, National Public Radio, The New Republic, and NBC. In Know Your Price, he takes readers on a tour of 6 Black majority cities whose assets and strengths are undervalued, beginning in his hometown of Wilkinsburg, a small city east of Pittsburgh. Also spotlights 5 others where he has deep connections: Detroit, Birmingham, New Orleans, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. He provides an intimate look at the assets that should be of greater value to residents, and that can be if they demand it. Dr. Emeka uses statistical methods, big data, and sociological theories to teach and research patterns of racial identity, racial exclusion, and immigrant adaptation in contemporary U.S. society. His research has been published in influential scholarly journals and referenced in popular media outlets, including the New York Times. Welcome to you both. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Emeka for us to begin our book chat. But just a reminder to all of you that you can type in questions using the chat button on the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring chat to try to pull those questions up, and we'll either take them when there's a moment in the conversation, or we'll certainly try to get to as many as possible by the end. We'll also be posting helpful links in chat, including a link to where you can buy a copy of Dr. Perry's book. Please consider making your purchase online at Northshire bookstores, so you'll be supporting a wonderful local business as well as reading a very powerful and compelling book. So let's get started. I'll turn things over to you, Amon.
All right, thank you so much, Ellen. First, I just want to say I appreciate the attendance of everybody who's on the call tonight, and I also want to say that it is a great pleasure to meet Dr. Perry, who I've never met before. So I'm talking to you, Dr. Perry. Pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure. How's it going?
All right.
And wait, I happy Mardi Gras.
Oh,
For all the, I know there's a few people in Saratoga who got their beads out. They were expecting me to represent. So happy Mardi Gras to all those from either New Orleans or the Caribbean. You know what this day means. So that's how I wanted to welcome folks.
all right. So I guess I just want to start by saying, so I had the pleasure of reading Dr. Perry's book just in the last week and a half or so, and I feel like I know a lot of his story. So I feel like this is a little uneven in that way. So I got a lot of background on Dr. Perry, and it's timely that indeed the stories that he tells of his own experience and the experiences of people who are very close to him is timely, has a lot of lessons for all of us about what's going on now and the sort of the historical roots of now in very kind of personal ways. So I appreciate the sharing in the book. And then I would also say that I'm a quantitative sociologist, a demographer by training, and so reading the book was a little bit almost like, reading an autobiography or a diary, but with data, even better, so
Exactly. Exactly.
So I appreciated it a great deal. I guess the first question or theme that I guess I would just put out there, and this is just kind of by way of introduction for folks who have not had a chance to read the book. I will this is not a spoiler, but I would just give you a hint that this is a book about the beauty of Blackness, and I would say, we could replace beauty with value, with the value of Blackness and things and all things Black, and as it relates to Black culture and Black people. And so there's I feel like it falls pretty well into a long line of debate, discussion about racial uplift. And where we need to focus our energies. And of course, I would say we need to focus our energies in lots of places. We need to focus our energies everywhere. But some folks, again, tend to focus on, we need to make sure that Black people, among other things, have adequate or fair opportunities for housing in the US. And usually what that boils down to for lots of folks is Black folks should have access to historically white neighborhoods that have lots of resources and good schools and low crime and so on and so forth. And that's really sort of where it's at. And I'm thinking here of Richard Rothstein's recent book, Color of Law. And Dr. Perry takes a different tack, and this is where the question comes. And it's a tack, again, not that new, but I think the articulation is splendid. The articulation is new, and in many ways it's certainly worth considering. And that is that rather than thinking a lot about how to get Black folks and upwardly mobile Black folks out into white suburbs, we need to ask the question: why is it that when Black folks concentrate in a place, things seem to deteriorate at least looking at it from the outside? And maybe a better question is, why is the perception that they're deteriorating from the outside? And I will confess that I'm from a place called Englewood, New Jersey, which is a predominantly Black and brown community that I only later found out, much after I left, that it was the only Black and brown community in northern New Jersey. I was surrounded by white communities. And I had a wonderful childhood. There were great teachers and businesses and so on, and things that were devalued in various ways, in ways that came to a head in the mid '90s in the Supreme Court for Englewood. But in any case, I just wonder if you could just kind of talk to that ongoing sort of, I'm not sure if it's tension between sort of I guess, for lack of a better term, an integrationist approach to uplift versus a more community-centered, Black community-centered approach that asks the question, how can we improve Black communities as opposed to how can we get access to communities that are not Black.
Yeah, I really started with home because, like you, I grew up in a Black majority city neighborhood called Wilkinsburg, which was surrounded by Pittsburgh on three sides. So I never really knew where Pittsburgh started or ended, or well, Wilkinsburg started or ended. It was all the same. There were, in the areas I grew up was primarily Black on the Wilkinsburg and as well as the Pittsburgh side. And I had everything literally at my feet. I had stores, universities close by. In the book, I talk about one of my running routes where I would run down Penn Avenue. It's the main thoroughfare that goes from Wilkinsburg to downtown Pittsburgh. And when I used to run, I used to see the businesses. I used to see the students going to work, the families going to work. Not that far away was the Westinghouse Corporation, which did hire some of the parents that of my friends. They worked at Westinghouse nearby. So I had this wonderful perception of where I lived. In fact, we used to brag about living in Wilkinsburg. We used to say, well, you live there. I hadn't laughed at people because we really believed we had it going on in Wilkinsburg. It wasn't until later, till I went to college, where people like, you went to Wilkinsburg? You survived? But it wasn't until then that I realized, whoa, how are people viewing where I grew up and how I grew up? I grew up, as the story was told to me, there was an older woman who made a deal with my maternal grandmother. My mother, she was poor. She was probably abused by my father. We don't necessarily know that, but all indicators point that she was abused. She was certainly poor. She had my brother when she was 15, had me when she was 17. And so a deal was made that this older woman of 63 when I was born would take me in. Eventually, my older brother came along with me, and she raised me in Wilkinsburg. And it was when I went to college and we read this thing called the Moynihan Report, which you're probably familiar with. Patrick Moynihan in the 60s wrote a piece that essentially was a state of Black America. And the theme of that was that poverty in the Black community, degradation in the Black community, was a result of women-headed households, and they were inherently flawed and causing poverty. And when I remember reading the Moynihan Report in college, I remember, is he talking about me? Like, this is the woman who took me out of harm's way, that protected me, that raised me, that did what Black women all throughout Pittsburgh did. They took care of community when private industry and government did not fill a breach. And so I remember, I wasn't a policy person then by any means, but I remember something was wrong with that. I was like, how could this be? So for me, I wanted to center the book on how she lived and how my family lived. A part of the story I didn't share, but in the book, that my father was a heroin addict. He was in and out of prison. He was probably abusive to my mother. He was abusive to other women. He, in one of his stints in prison, he was killed a day before his 27th birthday, I think 27th, 28th birthday. And he was stabbed, a single stab wound in the heart. And what I was always told that he died breaking up a fight. Now, I'd never believed that. and the evidence based upon the reports, not that I trust police reports all that much, but the police report stated that he died essentially early in the morning to a single stab wound to the heart. And so somebody got him. It was in an open area in a prison. So I wanted to see how he lived and how she lived. And so what I did was, in preparation for the book and a study that I did, I compared home prices in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. And I compared them to places where the share of the Black population was less than 1%, because I wanted to see the difference in resources, because so many policies and practices and services are drawn from the price of our homes. And, initially what we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced half as much as white neighborhoods. Now, a lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime. Well, those are things you can control for in a study. And that's what we did. We looked at home price, but we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's 156 billion in lost equity. Now, that's a big number. 156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Blacks use to start up the firms. It would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a four-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's more than double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. The reason why I put that in there is my father, who had a heroin addiction, was in and out of prison. I am absolutely clear that if he lived in a white neighborhood that was well-resourced, he would have had a greater opportunity to go to college, start a business, better schools, you name it. Now, I never excuse his behaviors, but I do say that devaluation was an accomplice. That the projection of who he was and where he lived extracted wealth that would have helped save his life. And so for me, I use that almost as a metaphor of sorts, that Black people are so much more valuable than we are, quote unquote, priced in housing, in education, in transportation, in economic development. We are just not valued correctly. And if we were, we would avoid so much of the mess that we see today. So, and that served as essentially the anchor for the book, because from there, I talk about economic development, I talk about reproductive justice, education, a lot of different things. But it started with housing, because housing is so important to other assets in our life that propel your economic mobility. So yeah, that's what grounds the book.
Thank you so much for that. I'm reminded, some of the folks in the audience may have seen an article this weekend in the Times-Union about a woman named Beathora Tillery, who sold her house. I don't know the details. It's a very sanitized story in my read of it in any case, to the city of Saratoga during a massive urban renewal sort of effort in Saratoga Springs in 1964. She sold her house for $8,500 in 1964, which is the equivalent of something like $70,000 today. And I was imagining, to your point, Dr. Perry, imagining what a family might do with that lost equity. So in Saratoga Springs presently, you can buy a falling down house for $250,000, maybe. I think some people would disagree. It's probably higher than that. And so essentially she was left with the equivalent of 1/3, maybe 1/4. And of course, you know, there's a lot of moving parts between 1964 and 2021 to be sure. But in any case, after having read your book and then reading this newspaper story, I was left with this acute sense of wealth denied, right? Even right here, maybe especially right here in our small community, Saratoga Springs.
Yeah, you know, our data we use, I should say, we use 2017 data. So just 1 year, we see 156 billion in losses. Now, clearly there is a time element to this as well, that generations of people are losing the equity to lift themselves up. And so for me, this is about restoring the generational wealth that has been robbed from Black Americans by predatory lending, redlining, racial housing covenants, other wealth draining practices, not just in the housing market, but in other markets, that we're constantly extracting wealth from Black families and then charging Black people for the problems in Black America. And, you know, that's why I have this T-shirt. There's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. It's a refrain throughout the book. And by the way, I'll make sure I'll put in the link where you can get it. It's Bailiwick Clothing, a T-shirt company in Washington, D.C. But I say it all the time because when something goes wrong in Black communities, we blame the residents in them. We say, oh, it all starts at home, asserting that people don't have home training. And, you know, but we simply don't have the resources that will propel people towards economic mobility. So the book, you know, it was personal for me. That's why I added a lot of memoir to it. But it is a policy book. I mean, it does make a policy point that we got to restore the value extracted by racism. And when we do, that will propel our communities, all of our communities, because not only are we robbing Black Americans and Black majority communities of wealth, we are suppressing an economy. You know, that's the other thing. We would be adding more jobs, more revenue, more innovation to the economy. And so for me, this is about restoring value to the communities that I grew up in, but also about showing people that resources are not as scarce as the racism allows it to be. We could have a broader pie if we invested in the underappreciated assets that are Black businesses, Black homes, Black schools, all those different things that are more valuable than they are priced.
Hey, to follow up on that, there's a line somewhere, and I can't, you probably know exactly where it is, about, and I've got it written down, you say that our decisions shouldn't be data-driven necessarily, they should be community-driven, right? And the data should be used in service of community goals and community, right, imperatives. I wonder if you kind of talk about that. Certainly in education circles, everything right these days of late, the last couple of decades, it's got to be data driven. Decisions have to be data driven, and I think there's some virtue in that, but there's also some weakness in that. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, when I got this that phrase from my work in education in New Orleans. I ran 4 charter schools in the city, and a lot of people would say, you need to be data driven, make hard choices. Well, I always pointed out, and I also was asked the question all the time, what's the fastest way to close the Black-white achievement gap? And I used to respond in a flippant kind of way. I said, well, the fastest way to close the black-white achievement gap is to stop educating white people. That's the fastest way, right? A lot of people may not be laughing. It's supposed to be a joke, but but in education, we've fired Black teachers, we've expelled Black students, we've done equally nefarious things to close the achievement gap. So the reason why I say don't be data driven is because you can do harmful things in the process of closing the gap. So the point of it is when people ask me what's the fastest way to close the achievement gap is that they weren't sure if it was possible. Yeah, you can close achievement gaps. All kids can learn. We need to look at the resources they have, the schools. Everybody can learn, but you gotta the question, how do you close a gap, is an ethical one, because you don't want to close the gap and do nefarious things to communities. Kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. And in New Orleans, I became disaffected by the charter movement because we were firing teachers en masse, which eroded the Black middle class, which hurt education. We were harming Black students with this no tolerance policy, suspending them at very high rates. We were expelling students at high rates. We were making kids walk on lines like they were in prison, in the kind of prison that my father died in. It was an inhumane way to close achievement gaps. So I say don't be data driven, be community driven. Use data. I'm a researcher, you're a researcher. We, in order to make fact-based decisions, you need the data. And so I do that, but I never say I'm driven by the data. I use it, I'm driven by community to make sure I don't do anything wrong to that community using the data.
I'm going to just take a second and plug, just to invite folks to offer a question. I want to turn attention to small communities like the one like Saratoga Springs. And so I guess I'm curious, very generally, have you thought about the kind of development efforts that you outlined in the first half of the book, incubators, accelerators, and whatnot, and those sorts of efforts in other kinds of cities? So certainly this is a book about Black majority cities. We're in a very different kind of place in that geographically, we're in a place that had a pretty robust and lively Black community until a few decades ago. And there were, and again, this is a mostly untold story, not entirely, I imagine Carol would say, that community was, chipped away at. Maybe some people would say it was obliterated by urban renewal. And now we have a relatively small Black community, Black population that's dispersed, not entirely, but mostly dispersed. So I wonder about efforts to build community in contexts like that. And let me just give you kind of one specific question.
Well, let's be clear. Saratoga Springs was decimated by urban renewal. The Black community, the Black parts of the community, and as it was in all parts of the country. Remember, in the 60s, there were efforts to essentially or what was told that they were going to refurbish many of the much of the urban blight that was occurring across the country because of a lack of investment caused by federal policy. But instead of really investing in communities, they bulldozed them. And oftentimes, and I think this is the case in Saratoga Springs, I'm pretty sure, that they bulldoze very communities that were alive, that they weren't necessarily, they might have been underinvested in, but they weren't moribund, but they decimated them nonetheless. And again, the value of Black people comes out of the wash and activities like that. You would never bulldoze a white town that had stores, businesses, schools, all the, you would never do that. But in Black America, that happened everywhere. And so again, that's a form of wealth extraction. Man, when you take out a business, a school, homes, you don't make that up for generations. I mean, and then in many cases, selling community short. In the cases of eminent domain, a lot of eminent domain was used. I'll share how I came up with the title of my book. It's usually I tell it at the end because it's dramatic, but it makes sense here. But I named the book "Know Your Price" after my favorite play in the whole wide world, Two Trains Running. In the play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his property seized through eminent domain by the city of Pittsburgh, who's building an arena. And they offer the main character, Memphis, $15,000 for the property, to which he replies, "No, I'm not selling my property. I got my price. I know my price." I'm paraphrasing, but it's a refrain throughout the book. Throughout the play. There's another character, Hambone, who a proprietor asks him to paint the fence in exchange for a ham. So Hambone paints the fence, but then when he tries to get his ham, the proprietor never gives him his ham. And throughout the play, he says, "Give me my ham, give me my ham, give me my ham." And we don't know if he has mental illness before he paints the fence, but eventually he goes mad and dies demanding his ham. Now there's a happy ending to the story. The main character, Memphis, gets $35,000 for his demands for equity. Now the moral of the story is you have to know you have worth. What my book, what it tries to do is give people the price to stand on, to say, you are messing with us. Here's what I will stand for, even if it means going crazy and dying. But we have to. Because if we bow to an inferior value, we're essentially second-class citizens. And so that's something we can't allow. But in places like Saratoga, they literally took our property, sold us, gave us pennies on the dollar for what it was worth, because they did not value us. And this continues to happen. At some point, you take a stand. You take a stand on that price. So whether you're in Saratoga, you need services, you need resources. States can't just give all the resources, should not give all the resources for community development in 3 or 4 cities in a state. This is a demand we must make upon governments, around private industry. Many cities have been selling the farm to get certain big tech companies in their communities, and they take away all the tax revenue that could have been used to develop talent in local communities. Now, I am all for businesses determining where they should go, and I understand all that. But understand that America is not 5 cities. And we have been facilitating the development of Boston, the Bay Area, LA, New York, a couple other places, and everything else can die on the vine. That can't continue. And so government, private industry, they need to hear from us, because it's not going to happen from just on because of the invisible hand of the market. No, it's going to happen because we demand equity in the places we need it.
We have a couple of audience questions. The first one, I'll just read this to you, and actually to all panelists and attendees. I'm gonna pitch it to Dr. Perry though. Are you hopeful the Biden administration will actually close the inequality gap in the U.S.? And second, if asked to serve in his cabinet, would you serve?
I probably would not serve in his cabinet because I love what I do too much. And I would say that one, Biden won't do it himself. This is a multi-generational effort, but he said equity more than all the rest of the presidents combined, including the first Black president. I mean, I didn't measure that, but it really seems like it. But he's uplifted the term equity as a matter of fairness, and he wants to make policies fair. I wrote a piece on Brookings with economist Derek Hamilton titled "We Should Score Bills for Equity the same way we score bills against the budget," or something like that. But we should demand that equity be accounted for in all of our policies. You know, it was illegal to discriminate against Black residents. If we had the people who demanded equity, I mean, we did have the people demanding equity then in the past, but we may not have had the power to get the president elected to do the things we've done. Now we have that. We've got to keep pressing Biden to put some teeth to his equity plans and not just talk about fairness, but to talk about that other type of equity, resources. Because the way we're going to get out of this is the way we're going to get out of the Great Depression. We put money in the hands of potential homeowners in the form of down payment assistance, low interest loans. We're going to do it through investing in families. And if we do that, we can close a lot of the gaps that we currently see. And I see one other question that I'm going to hit right on. I actually do believe in reparations. I also have a report on reparations and why it matters. Look, if we're honest, we all believe in reparations. After a few weeks of being socially distant, you heard businesses say, we need relief. We need the federal government to step up. Well, try being socially distanced for generations. What does that look like? What kind of relief package do you get? It does look like reparations of some sort. And so for me, it's also about the moral responsibility. People were robbed of housing benefits, robbed during slavery of labor, land, opportunities to get an education. It was legal. It was legal to discriminate and suppress people's growth. But the extra harm of that is that many of our policies hurt Black people to enrich white people. You know, it wasn't just to hurt Black people. It was to hoard wealth. One of the reasons why we see systems set up, or school financing systems set up in the way that prioritizes or uplifts property taxes is for higher income communities to hoard that wealth. There's other ways to finance schools that are much more equitable, but we don't do it. That comes out of an era of segregation. And by the way, liberals and conservatives, when it comes to education, they're like, oh, don't go there. Don't take money away from my school and my kid. But the reality is we need a more equitable system. Schools predominated by people of color get $23 billion less than their white counterparts. $23 billion less. So for me, if we don't address this equity problem we have in many different markets, you're always going to see unrest. You're always going to see disproportionate death. You're always going to see these economic shocks hit disenfranchised communities hard, because after every single one, we take 2 steps back because we don't have the wealth, the cushion of wealth to help us get through these incidents, these tragedies. So yeah, I believe in reparations. We all do if we were honest. We just don't like Black people to get reparations, and so we need to change that perspective.
I'm inclined, I guess, to go to a very specific question here that I have as a father of children in Saratoga Springs in schools where there are very few Black teachers, for instance. I think certainly I can count them on one hand. So for me, a question is always, where are the Black teachers? And where is, where are the Black teachers? Is long and short of it. And I think that is a concern. I think that's widespread. You speak to the importance for Black children of having Black teachers at the head of the classroom on occasion in the book. And I wonder if you could speak about that. And I guess I would also ask if you could kind of search your memory banks. I'm envious of the conversations that you've had over the last several months with lots of different people about their experiences. But I wonder if you've run across models that have been successful in diversifying faculties, at high schools and middle schools in places like a Saratoga Springs, right, where the population is 90% white.
Well, one of the reasons why we're losing Black teachers is because of the cost of education and the pay of teachers. Many teachers are people who go into private liberal arts institutions. They take on Black people because we don't have wealth. We take on more student loans. And when you look at the loan profile, many Black people make the decision of not going into teaching because they feel that it takes too long to get rid of their loans, and they're right in a lot of circumstances. And so we've seen a decline in teachers for that. And that reason, we also see a decline in teachers in right to work states where it's easier to fire teachers. We know that Black people in general, the Black middle class, I should say, are over-indexed in public jobs where there are unions because in often places, discrimination leads to us not lasting very long. But the areas where I see Black teachers coming into largely white environments are places where you have universities that attract some Black students. And because, oftentimes some of your first jobs are that of teaching, and many kids, or I should say students, who go to school at maybe a Skidmore or wherever, and they're there for 4 years. They get to know the town, they get to know people, and hey, they say, "Let me take a job," and they end up staying on a lot of times. And so, colleges and universities, and I won't. I mean, people always say HBCUs, but we can't get all teachers from HBCUs. But colleges and universities are doing a better job of attracting diverse talent. So schools need to tap into those places where there is some diversity, and we need to figure out ways to cancel student loan debt using teaching as a incentive. If I really do believe that if we can have people cancel certain percentages of debt with every year as a teacher, you would see an increase in teachers of color. And so we need to do things like that to, again, so much of my work is around increasing wealth profiles. You do that, you give a person a job and you cancel debt, you increase their wealth profile. And so teaching should be a much more diverse field than it is. And because right now we're hemorrhaging Black and brown teachers at this point. And we got to figure out a way to incentivize them in the field.
I'd also just point the audience to Dr. Perry's chapter on teachers. There's a pretty robust literature on the importance of Black teachers, in particular for Black students.
Yeah, and I should say, yeah, that I forgot to mention that Black teachers, for whatever reason, have better lead to better academic outcome, better social outcomes. And they're good for Black students and white students, brown students, because clearly having brown skin doesn't make you a better teacher, but there's something about the experience that says that Black child should have higher expectations than they're given. So just like an appraiser or a real estate agent will look badly upon Black communities, Black teachers actually look good upon Black students around white students. They see the good, they see the potential, they see the opportunity for growth. And so for me, that's what the difference is. And so that's another reason why we need more Black teachers, because they simply have higher expectations of Black students.
I would encourage everyone in the audience to ask yourself that question also. That is, when I'm thinking about, why I have some ideas on this myself, I'm happy to share online or offline. But why aren't there more Black folks in Saratoga Springs? There have been more in the past than there are now. Why aren't community institutions as robust as they once were? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves and probe deeply and honestly as we can for the betterment of this community. I wanted to turn to a question, a really interesting question about Charles Blow's book, Encouraging Black People to Move to Southern Cities Such as Atlanta. And the question is, what do you think?
Well, I would say that people are already moving to the South, and a lot of people are moving to the South for a bunch of reasons. Cost of living is lower, more land, bigger house. I will say this, that moving to the South won't necessarily shield you from discrimination. And so we need equity in all places. There's never been a time where the majority of Black Americans did not live in the South. And so we've always been there. We still have problems. But I will say that you saw during this last presidential election, the landscape is changing because people are not only moving to the cities, they're moving to the suburbs around Atlanta and other places. And so the electoral landscape has changed dramatically. We're seeing more Black majority municipalities / suburbs all throughout the South. You're seeing new Black mayors all throughout the South, particularly in the Deep South, the Confederate South. And so places like Louisiana has Black mayors in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport. Alabama has Black mayors in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile. Georgia, you're seeing all these new Black mayors. And so there's a shift. And so, yes, moving to a place where there's a high concentration of us provides layers of protection. But, we will always have significant people living in the North. We will always have significant people in the South. So move if you would like, or move to Chicago, move to DC. there's a critical mass, and I'll move to Saratoga. There's lots of places where we can thrive, and we should be able to thrive wherever we exist. And so, but I'm working on another book now that's examining, what are the conditions that we actually need, quantifying the needs in all places for us to have economic mobility.
Say, to that point, I have a very specific question. So on page 55 of your book, you mentioned that 115 out of 117 Black majority cities have undervalued property values in Black neighborhoods. So there's 2 in which that's not the case, presumably. And I'm wondering, have you spent a lot of time thinking about those 2?
Well,
actually, and what are they? I'm genuinely.
Well, there's actually more than that now. There's a little bit of difference between when the data was.
Oh, you muted yourself.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that there's actually a few more now, but there's a few that it's real, like the home prices that are higher in Black majority neighborhoods, places like Nashville. Believe it or not, they have higher home values, actually, and relative poverty, meaning poverty between Black people, brown people, and white people are closing. And so it seems more egalitarian. Employment is up. They have they have Black institutions that are anchored in Nashville. So you have a medical school, Meharry Medical School, historically Black college, university. You also have Fisk. And so there are places where you say, oh, things are actually, it's not by any means, there's still problems there, but it's not as bad in Nashville as it is across the way in Memphis, which is struggling. And so there are a few places here and there that have bright spots. Another place that has somewhat of a bright spot is, and I didn't mention this, St. Louis. St. Louis, has the highest percentage of businesses compared to the population. And so there's something there that enables businesses to get started in St. Louis.
Hey, so I would add to that, and this is again for the audience. One of the lessons of this book is that the tendency tends for us to be that when we see Black people struggling, we often think about individual responsibility, individual, behaviors, habits, or what have you. So we ask what's wrong with them, rather than what's wrong with the context. So like this Memphis versus Nashville thing, it's totally legitimate to ask what's wrong with Memphis, right? What's wrong with that context, as opposed to what's wrong with individuals in that context. That's a whole different question. That's not to say that's irrelevant, but we have to ask that question. I would say the same thing. I do similar research on unemployment gaps. And, for instance, Huntsville, Alabama is good by my measure in that Black folks in Huntsville, Alabama have odds of employment that are similar to those of whites, which is true almost nowhere, by the way, right? In most metropolitan areas, the unemployment rate, the odds of unemployment are 2 or 3 times the high for Black workers who are on the labor market looking for work. But typically we ask what's wrong with Black workers rather than asking what's wrong with Rochester. And that's not, I didn't just pull that up in thin air. Rochester has a particularly bad, large gap. What's wrong with Rochester versus what's going on in Rochester that's not going on in Huntsville or vice versa. So thinking about context rather than thinking about individuals.
And that's what I generally mean when I say there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. One of my favorite quotes, and I never know how to pronounce the name, is Thich Thich Han, the Vietnamese philosopher, who once said, if you're growing a head of lettuce and it's not growing, you don't blame the lettuce. You look to see if it's getting water, you see if it's getting sunlight, you look to see if the soil is rich, but you never blame the lettuce. When it comes to Black people in communities, we're constantly blaming the lettuce. We're saying, what's wrong with you? Instead of looking at the overall environmental conditions we live in. And so for me, I do say, what's wrong with Rochester? What's wrong with Memphis? Because it's not Black people. It's, folks can learn, folks have businesses. One of the studies I did, we scraped all the Yelp data from businesses across the country to get a sense of quality. And one of the things we found is that Black, brown, and Asian businesses are rated higher on Yelp than their white counterparts, but they get less revenue as businesses in Black neighborhoods get Blacker. So folks are avoiding going into the hood. Now, our elders used to say a quote that makes sense. Our ice is just as cold. They knew that our businesses are just as good, but the perception of our neighborhoods are not. And people bypass quality in the hood all the time. But again, our businesses are just as good. And by the way, we don't need any more, this is an aside, we don't need any more programs to jump through these hoops of fiscal or financial education courses or financial literacy courses to get a loan. Many programs out there have Black-owned businesses doing all this training, when the research shows that our businesses are just as good as white businesses, meaning that we don't need training anymore than the white business owner. But we have all these businesses that make Black people jump all through these hoops to simply get a grant or a loan. And it doesn't make any sense. We just need the investment. And so for me, it's, we need a new paradigm. Let's stop blaming Black, just for a moment. Don't assume that Jamal could get into college or to Harvard by just pulling up his pants and wearing a belt. Let's assume that that's not the reason why he's not going to college. Let's assume that it has something to do with whether his grandfather owned a home and that equity was passed on to their parents, and their parents had the discretionary resources to put in their child's education. That's much more the reason than some character deficit or some fancy, so you know what I'm saying. So the point is, we got to stop blaming Black people for problems we did not cause.
Folks, I want to say thank you all for your participation here. So I think we're over time. I don't know. I'm not getting word that we need to stop, but I want to, if anyone, I know that this was scheduled to go to 6:30. So if anyone needs to jump off the call, that's fine. And
I have to go because I need to celebrate.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
I need to celebrate.
All right.
Mardi Gras.
What do we say on Mardi Gras?
What's that?
What do we say on Mardi Gras? What do we yell right now? I don't even know.
Happy Mardi Gras.
Happy Mardi Gras all. Hey, it's been a pleasure, Dr. Perry. We thank all of you for your participation, your presence here tonight. We hope that you continue to give these things deep thought and pick up Dr. Perry's book. It's well worth it. And I will look forward to crossing paths with many of you in the coming years and months.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, thank you both. That was a terrific conversation.
All right.
Are we done broadcasting?
Yes.
We're still recording.
Well, Amon, I just want to say thank you, Purdy.